My name's Eric Clark, and this is my good friend, Derek White. Just got to meet him for the first time in person today at Nerdcon here in Minneapolis. Nerdcon Stories. This is an event that Hank Green and some other folks, the same people who put on VidCon every year, coordinated to plan to put on here in Minneapolis. The idea is to talk about stories and why they matter. I think the slogan they're using for the con is we're all made of stories. Is that?
Yeah.
We're all made of stories, which seemed like a perfect continuing ed thing for a pastor to go to talk about stories and how they matter and why they matter.
Has it surprised you there are so many pastors here?
I mean, it's been a really pleasant surprise. I mean, I'm not...
At least 5 I've counted. At least 5. No, 6.
6, you're right.
6 pastors.
6 that we know of. There may be others out there that we haven't
There are more
met.
of us than you know. It's scary.
and it makes sense, right? I mean, what is more central to the job of the pastor than figuring out a way to tell stories in a way that people can relate to, that can help them make purpose out of their lives, can help draw purpose out of their lives for them, and which can be compelling and engaging.
Oh, I'm telling you, it's been amazing the number of 18-year-olds and younger parents with their kids. I've seen some kids that were in junior high, and then a lot of 20-somethings too, a ton of 20-somethings as well. So those are the people who want to hear stories, and it's amazing to see their love of books, their love of literature. I mean, we so often hear as pastors the people decrying this up-and-coming generation, and they're full of it. This is a generation that is intelligent, witty, yet humorous, and they want to hear stories that are transformative.
Yeah,
really do.
yeah. I mean, I think arguably that this is a generation that reads more than most previous generations, in that, I mean, perhaps largely due to the Harry Potter phenomenon and the YA explosion that happened following Harry Potter. This is a generation that has grown up knowing from a young age that books were for them, that they were supposed to read, and that books were exciting and interesting. And whereas when I grew up, there were books out there that I enjoyed, and I read a ton, but a lot of times it felt like I was having to get books off my dad's shelf, I was having to dig through and find the books that were really meant for adults, but I was going to read them anyway.
Like Stephen King, The Dark Tower.
Right.
Remember that? I mean, my mother, who was not a big fantasy reader, had The Dark Tower, and I remember pulling that off and reading it, and then pulling it off the shelf and reading it, and scaring myself to death for the next month straight, but I think I was 14 or 15 when it came out, but we had to grab our parents' books, and so this is a generation of kids who have books written for them. They really do.
Absolutely. So while I'm with the Geek Preacher, I really wanted to ask particularly about the kinds of stories that we love, science fiction and fantasy, or what might broadly be called speculative fiction. Like, what is it about speculative fiction that lends itself so well to theological thinking? Because I know a lot of pastors, even pastors who wouldn't necessarily come to an event like Nerdcon or wouldn't call themselves nerds, but who really love science fiction and fantasy and draw a lot from it in their theology.
I would say science fiction especially appeals, especially when I was coming up, it appealed to a hope for a future. That's very eschatological. It appealed to a new creation, a new world, a new universe opening up with possibility, with hope. I used to, when I was coming up, I read a lot of early Isaac Asimov. Before the Foundation series and all of that. I read some of his early stuff that was way before my time. But there was something in Asimov's writing that always was very hopeful, that humanity would progress, that it would become better, that humanity would flourish. And I think that is the hope of our story. And that is the hope of God, is that humanity flourishes and becomes greater, becomes what God wants us to become. And that gives you a drive to create. I mean, it created the space race in the 60s. It created the moonwalk. It created all these things. It created the phones. Star Trek created the phones we have in our pockets today. And so speculative fiction really broadens us. And I think as pastors, it gives us that sense of hope that sadly too often Christianity has had a story of hopelessness.
Right.
The world's going to hell in a handbasket, it's all going to fall apart. And there is that in the fantasy, there's the apocalyptic side, but I think in the science fiction side there was always this hope that was there. We've seen it turn darker at times, but there's always the underlying thing of hope.
Well, but in a way, even the darker stuff, even the dystopian sort of fiction, is eschatological, as you say, in that it's providing a warning of possible futures which relate to our choices today. Like, it's still, the purpose of dystopian fiction isn't just to sort of just dwell in, isn't it awful? But
unless it's H.P. Lovecraft.
Unless it's H.P. Lovecraft.
Okay.
But some of it is to create a sense of urgency for us now to want to change. We're facing choices which are significant. So someone like Paolo Bacigalupi, who wrote Wind Up Girl and wrote a recent book about drought and stuff, he writes a lot about like potential environmental catastrophes.
Right.
And you know, his work, even where it's dark, is intended to sort of inspire or encourage toward the nobler, toward the better path, to warn humanity away from the dark future that is portrayed.
Kind of like the Old Testament writers. I mean, that's what the Old Testament prophets did all the time. They told these dark stories of judgment. And Jesus is famous for having said that one phrase, unless you repent, you likewise shall perish.
Or Amos saying, why do you long for the day of the Lord? The day of the Lord is darkness, not light.
Right.
To Israel, saying that be prepared. If we continue living in this unjust way, keep trampling on the heads of the poor, that the consequences that we reap will be negative and terrible.
And I think you're absolutely right, and that's what even dystopic future does. It warns us that that's a negative path to head down, and to turn from that negative path and become more just and caring people. That's excellent.
It's interesting that you bring up the word eschatology, because just a couple of weeks ago, John Green in a Q&A was one of the questions that was what is a word that you use that is like a pretentious author word that other people don't know or whatever, and John's like, he's been using this word eschatological a lot lately, and
John was on his way to becoming an Episcopal priest,
right? That he has some religious training in his background is there, and every now and then that leaks out in his videos. As one of the things I love actually about John is that he brings, if not an explicitly religious sensibility, a sort of theological sensibility to the way that he approaches his worldview and way he talks to his audience, to young people, which I think is really valuable. There are a number of Vlogbrothers videos, particularly John's videos, but some of Hank's videos as well, which would double as excellent sermons.
Oh yeah. I would agree. I've seen quite a few of his things, and I just was surprised at how, before I knew his background, at how theological it sounded and how caring it sounded. And I said, man, that just sounds so pastoral. And so this was a few years back, and I started looking him up. I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. He was trained. He had a pastor's heart, and that's understandable. And I think that's what he shows and what he's doing with these kids here, and starting something like Nerdcon. That whether he's a pastor or not, he has a pastor's heart for people to tell them stories that will. I mean, we're sitting in the session today, and I hear somebody say, we want to tell stories that transform people's lives, and I'm going, dude, do you know how many preachers I've heard say that? And I was like, you sure you're not a preacher?
Right.
I was like, this is church, man.
Yeah.
Or at least what the church should be.
Right. Exactly. There is an element of aspirational, if only the church were more like this in some ways. We talked about science fiction just now and how it's kind of eschatological, but earlier today we were having a conversation about fantasy a little more, and about the importance of imagination, and how the most important thing that fairy stories have to teach us is not that dragons exist, but that dragons can be defeated. There's a certain sense in which the ability to imagine, even if that means imagining orcs and elves and dwarves and dragons and stuff, is fundamental to the ability to transform the world, to make the world better.
Right.
Because unless you can imaginatively perceive the world as other than it is, you don't have the capacity to be able to begin to improve the world, to change the world.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons I love G.K. Chesterton, whom we were talking about. Chesterton talked about that a lot, and one of the things he said is, it's this imagination that helps us see a way out of the darkness. So even as a young child, as a baby, you need this imagination that helps you know that here you are, you're this powerless little child in a world where you have nothing but giants walking around you. Everything is huge and horrific and scary. And it's the imagination of slaying the giants, of overcoming that, of the darkness of the fear. And it's without that imagination, how can you find your path out of the darkness? I mean, one of my favorite comic books was a Batman story many years ago. This was probably in the 80s. And one of the interesting things was Batman went to a world where there was no Batman. And so
like
it was an alternate universe story.
well, no, but I was thinking of the famous Christmas movie with Jimmy Stewart.
It's a Wonderful
It's
Life.
a Wonderful Life. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Batman's life.
Well, he went to a world where there was no Batman, but what he did in the story was there was a Bruce Wayne, and he actually got to save his parents. But he realized in doing that there would be no Batman, or at least he thought there would be no Batman. And in that world there were no superheroes or anything like that to make Bruce Wayne aspire to that. But what made Bruce Wayne aspire was he had seen this heroic figure rescue him, and it showed the books he was reading. He was reading Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was reading Robin Hood. And so it showed all these things that young Bruce Wayne was reading, and that world eventually had a Batman, because it was the stories of fiction. We consider Sherlock Holmes classical literature, but it was that inspired that Bruce Wayne to become a Batman. It was Robin Hood. These stories of fantasy are an innate part of who we are as human beings, and they inspire us to be more than we are. And that's what the gospel story is inspiration to become better than we are, to be more than we are.
And how appropriate that you bring up Robin Hood. You might not realize the church that I'm serving right now is Sherwood United Methodist.
I did not know that.
And I just concluded this last week a 5-part series on Robin Hood and the theology of Robin Hood. So.
Oh, that's awesome! I did not know that. That is amazing.
So.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Synchronicity, brothers.
Absolutely.
Synchronicity. Right
Absolutely.
there.
Oh, Derek, I am so happy I met you today. I've been following you for years on the internet, but I'm glad to finally put a face to it.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for interviewing me. And keep up the good work. Keep telling stories, brother.
School visits where 4 people knew who I was. It was like 2008, and like 850 people didn't know who I was, but the 4 people who did know who I was were so excited, and they all had on like handmade T-shirts, Nerdfighter T-shirts, but there were like 796 kids who were like, well, I guess I don't have to go to English class today, and so I had to like win them over, and it's super hard to win over a crowd like that, and I was so scared, but they really liked me. They were laughing at everything I said. It was so enjoyable. Everything was going perfectly. And then I, at the end of my incredibly like moving performance, I said, "Are there any questions?" And like 800 hands shot up, and I was like, "I am a genius." And I pointed at someone, and they said, "Mr. Green, are you aware that your fly is down?" And it wasn't just like, it wasn't down. It was like open. It's like all of my excitement and enthusiasm, and it just gotten more, and it was just a nightmare. And I walked out, and I always very subtly do this when I walk out, and this is the first time in my whole life since that day in San Francisco when I've been like, oh